Our gospel reading on this third Sunday of Easter is taken from the gospel according to Luke. Luke chapter 24 and verses 13 to 35. Listen to what the Spirit might speak into your life today in this reading from Luke. Now on that same day, two of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem, and talking with each other about all these things that had happened. While they were talking and discussing, Jesus himself came near and went with them, but their eyes were kept from recognizing him. And he said to them, "What are you discussing with each other while you walk along?" They stood still, looking sad. Then one of them, whose name was Cleopas, answered him, "Are you the only stranger in Jerusalem who does not know about the things that have taken place there in these days?" He asked them, "What things? What things?" They replied, "The things about Jesus of Nazareth, who was a prophet and mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, and how our chief priests and leaders handed him over to be condemned and crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. Yes, and besides all this, it is now the third day since these things took place. Moreover, some of the women of our group astounded us. They were at the tomb early this morning, and when they did not find the body of Jesus there, they came back and told us that they had seen a vision of angels who said that he was alive. Some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but they did not see him." Then Jesus said to them, "Oh, how foolish you are, and how slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have declared. Was it not necessary that the Messiah should suffer these things and then enter into his glory?" Then, beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them the things about himself in all the scriptures. As they came near to the village to which they were going, he walked ahead as if he were going on. But they urged him strongly, saying, "Stay with us, because it is almost evening, and the day is now nearly over." So he went in to stay with them. When he was at table with them, he took bread, blessed and broke it, and gave it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. They said to each other, "Were our hearts not burning within us while he was talking to us on the road, while he was opening the scriptures to us?" That same hour they got up and returned to Jerusalem, and there they found the 11 and their companions gathered together. They were saying, "The Lord has risen indeed, and he has appeared to Simon." Then they told what had happened on the road and how he had been made known to them in the breaking of the bread. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Were our hearts not burning within us while he spoke to us in the way? Or in a different translation, were our hearts not all ablaze when he spoke to us on the road? When he said the kinds of things that Jesus used to say? When he told us about things that we probably already should have known if we'd been listening? When he assured us that despite our sorrow and our loss, everything was okay? That somehow things had to be the way they were, as bad as they were? Did our hearts not burn within us? Has that ever happened to you? Have you ever felt God's presence in your flesh, in your body, in your skin? Sometimes it comes to us and it calls us out of our sadness, out of our grief, out of our fear. It calls us home to everything that we were meant to be. He comes as one unknown as he did on that road, and yet something in us knows him, and our very flesh cries out and responds. He calls us to a self that we never knew, but which we most fully are. As they say these days, if you know, you know. And once you know, you can't escape the knowing. You belong to what you know. And at times you have known God. At times God has reached into your life and shown you in a special way the thing that was always true, but which mostly goes unnoticed. And that's that God was walking with you all along. Namely, God's presence, God's love, God's guidance in the forward way. Now, I figure that I am old enough that I can start doing like other old men and telling the same stories over and over and the same jokes and ignoring you when you give me signs that you've already heard them. In addition to that, this morning I'm going to reminisce a little bit about the past. Just a little bit. I did not go to Cameroon at the age of 25 with missionary zeal to convert the heathen and change the world. I went because I was kind of adrift, and it seemed like a fun thing to do at the time. It was the mid-90s, and we were Generation X, and that was what we were doing, in case you don't remember, back in those days. We were going to live overseas. The Cold War was won. The Berlin Wall had come down. We thought that Russia would settle into, a calm and peaceful old age. We'd plugged the hole in the ozone layer. Whole swaths of the earth were suddenly available to us that were closed before. Prague was all the rage back in those days. And for a while, unless I'm remembering it incorrectly, for a while, maybe 2 years, maybe a year and a half, everything felt good. Maybe I'm wrong about that. But from where I was standing, it looked like we saw the world with a lot of hope. There were no villains left. Everything was going to be good. And it was beautiful to live in a time where we even had an illusion like that. My heart grieves for anyone who never knew an America before school shootings or before we found out about climate change. Now, of course, we squandered it. We were not grateful for it. We did not deserve peace and prosperity any more than any other generation. And I don't know why it was so fashionable to be sad back in those days. Actually, I don't know, aside from the fact that our parents all had lead poisoning and it made them kind of mean. That was supposed to be funny. Sorry, guys. I think also there was the fact that things like meaning and God were already sort of specialty items on the menu of life back in those days. They were not central anymore. More about that below. But the world was good to us. As long as we looked the right way and behaved the right way, the world was good to us. And our time in Eden was brief, as such times must always be. We weren't aware of the darkness even then that lingered along the edges of things, the discontent. We weren't really aware, us white kids, of the unfairness that many of our benefits were grounded in. And for me, all of that hope-filled era came crashing down with the Oklahoma City Federal Building exactly 28 years ago this past Wednesday. I was there, as most of you know. And you could probably guess from the fact that I keep talking about it that a part of me still is. But I digress. The point is that we are often blind to Jesus walking among us and in our midst while he's there. And we see him best in the rearview mirror while we're driving away. I went to Africa because I needed to get out of Oklahoma City after the bombing. I did not think of myself as a missionary particularly, though I did work as one. I taught and worked as an administrator in a Presbyterian high school for African kids. I was the only white guy. And about 1 year into my 5-year stay over there, the school's Cameroonian chaplain showed up at my door late at night, like 10:30, 11. And he was teetering a little drunkenly, as he sometimes did. He drank a lot, but he was a good guy. He told me, "Brian, you're going to read the scripture passage tomorrow at the chapel service." Now, Pastor Mamia was not the kind of guy you said no to, especially when he had been drinking, but I had to say no. 800 students? He wanted me to stand up in 12 hours with no preparation and read in front of 800 students? I mean, back in America, before I ever went to Cameroon, if they asked me to help take up the offering, I got scared. Because people would see me walking down the aisle, and I did not like to be in the spotlight at any time. I still don't love it. And he wanted me to read first in French and then in English, a long passage, the passage that we have just read about the road to Emmaus. This was the week after Easter. It's a long story, it's a beautiful story. It meant that I would stand up there in that high pulpit for a good long while to read it in 2 languages, with 800 kids staring back at me. And they did so in perfect silence. Now that was new for me, because those kids could not so much as glance at me without laughing. Back in those days, they would do impressions of the way I talked, and they would mock my French, and they would make fun of my accent. Whenever they saw me, they would whisper to each other, and I have no idea what they were saying. But this time it was different. As the scriptures were read, they were listening. And in that moment, in that high old central pulpit with 800 students looking at me, full of terror, in that moment, my eyes were opened, and my heart burned within me. And I knew there and then that despite my legendary stage fright, there would be more pulpits in my future, because I loved seeing the scriptures come alive and registering in the eyes of those kids. Eyes in which I'd mostly seen laughter and derision. I got it. And I got it from seeing them getting it. Each of them had brought their own story to that story that day. Each of them had brought their own bundle of experiences, their own life to that story that day. And the Holy Spirit was whispering a different meaning into each person who heard it that day. It was scary, and I'm still afraid to stand here. But there was no turning back from that moment in time. If you know, you know. And once you know, there is no unknowing. Well, as this joyous Eastertide works its way into its third week of 7, on its 50-day march to Pentecost, it has saved one of its best resurrection stories for last, this one here in the Gospel of Luke. This wonderful appearance of Jesus is like many very good Bible stories. It appears only in Luke, like the prodigal son and the Good Samaritan. And this story especially has captured the imagination of many artists. I don't know if you're thinking of the painting that I'm thinking of at the Carnegie Museum of Art here in Pittsburgh in Oakland, where there's a larger-than-life depiction of this scene with the sun setting behind Jesus' head, and it makes his hair glow like he's a redhead. And it's the moment right when he's breaking the bread. I've got a print of that painting hanging on the wall in my office. The 19th century Frenchman who painted it, he painted himself into the margins of the scene looking on like this, in disbelief, and his wife and his child kneeling and looking on reverently in pure belief. But if you were one of those 2 disciples on the road to Emmaus, you might be looking on in disbelief at the behaviors Jesus is getting engaged in here. I mean, they invite a stranger into their home to spend the night because it's getting late, and he's walking on the road. He sits down at the table, and he takes the bread, and he says grace, and he breaks the bread. That would border on rude for a guest in most homes, I believe. And yet it's a reminder that always at Christ's table, he is both guest and host. He breaks the bread, and in that moment their eyes are opened, and they recognize the living Christ in the breaking of the bread, which are words that you hear every time we celebrate communion here at this church. And that's really what the road to Emmaus story is about. It's about the fact that even though Jesus has disappeared from our eyes, we will meet him when we come together at his table. And if today were a communion Sunday, that would be what the sermon would be about. Instead today, I want to linger on this other truth, that there are times when God appears to us, when God reveals God's self to us in remarkable ways that we should never forget, and ways that are especially notable because they happen when we're just going about life. Our workaday walks to Emmaus or to Grant Street or to Rolliers. Most of us drive, I guess. How rarely we pause to see the Christ who walks beside us, though he's always there. How rarely we see him and know him for who he is. There are times when he appears to us most fully, and those times, if you can think of them in your own life, those times need to be cherished and held up against those times when he feels so entirely absent and so scarce. When have you really, really known Jesus at your side? When has he broken into your regular old world and called you to see more clearly, called you to do better, called you to be better, called you to start again? Like my first time in the pulpit, you have watershed experiences that have changed everything for you. Maybe it was a work trip, a mission trip, a summer youth camp. Maybe it was a Sunday morning. Maybe it was a Tuesday. Are you living faithfully to those experiences, those clear visions of God by your side? Because most days, most of the time, we act like there is no God. We act like we've never seen. I mean, really, though, how do you walk 7 miles with someone you know and not recognize them? How is that even possible? Even walking at a decent clip, as I told the kids, that would take you about 2 hours. Well, I guess the bigger question is, what keeps us from seeing things and people in our lives? What prevents us from seeing the things that really matter? Why do we ever fail to see God's presence as we walk along our daily lives? I don't think we can judge Cleopas and the other disciple too harshly when we do the same thing most days of our lives. We don't see God in our days and in our hours. We look past the living Christ most of the time. Like us Gen Xers who took life's prosperity and peace for granted, you and I get so hung up that we find it hard to know what we've got while we've got it. On Hulu, I am currently watching a very gripping remake of the old novel by Charles Dickens, Great Expectations. It's funny, I think I've mentioned Dickens 2 weeks running. That's unusual. There's a remake on Hulu of Great Expectations, that novel by Dickens. I had to read it probably in about 10th grade, I think, and it was really the first book that I liked and that I really enjoyed. The Hulu version, of course, is for a 21st century TV audience, so it has to be a little more fast-paced. So they've got opium smoking, and they've got they've inserted some sexual content and a lot of violence that you don't get in the original book. But they really do a pretty good job of it. Great Expectations gives us one of the most memorable and woefully ridiculous characters in all of literature, in the person of Miss Havisham. I'm not seeing many looks of recognition. Miss Havisham was a rich, elderly woman who got jilted at the altar decades and decades ago. And she spends the rest of her life wearing her wedding dress and brooding about how she was disappointed, how her love and her expectation was dashed, and the shame of it all. And she trains up a young lady to break the hearts of men, just the way her heart had been broken, until at last she succeeds at breaking a heart. And she sees herself in her victim, and she feels nothing but regret and compassion at that point. Dickens delighted in creating these unbelievably extreme characters who could never really exist in the real world. But he did it in order to highlight certain things in human beings. That's satire. That's what it's called. Miss Havisham illustrates the soul that is stuck in the past, that can't let go, that cannot embrace today's joys, because they are too stuck on yesterday's joys that they lost. She's a bitter heart. She's got enough money, she could have anything she wants. But all she wants is the one thing that none of us gets: yesterday. She wants yesterday. She wants it back. She's a cartoon of you and me. You know, if we fail to recognize God's presence right beside us, and God's love and the contentment that that offers, right there with us, as we go about our daily Emmaus journeys, then maybe it's because we too are too busy looking at things that we can't have, or things that don't matter, or things that distract us, lesser things. Some of us really are looking at yesterday. Some of us, i.e. me, are so stuck on the past, like for me, 2019, when we had 30 kids at the children's sermon. You remember 2019? But in 2019, we were all longing for another day too, weren't we? We were longing maybe for 1955, 1975. This is surely the fate of a lot of clergy these days. We're looking backward. But is there not something beautiful and something good in this time? Is there not fresh opportunity if we would only see it in these days too? But it's not always the past. It's not always the past that blinds us. Some of us can't see today because we're so worried about tomorrow and the ways we imagine it might be. And that's not the only thing that clouds our vision. Some of us are blinded by envy or pride, regret, anger, sadness, doubt. If you stare at any one of these things long enough, you'll see it everywhere. And we become the things that we train our eyes upon. We become the things that we entertain, that we dwell on. But I'd wager that you've had an experience of God's presence and God's love someplace in your life. Actually, I take it back, I would not wager because Presbytery would disapprove. I'm almost certain that if you told us your life story, we would see places where God revealed God's self to you most clearly in ways that were memorable and powerful, ways that probably are the thing that brings you back to church, even today. And if you can dwell on that moment, then that is the thing that you will stare at and that you'll see elsewhere. Not that we should live in the past, certainly not. But if we can remember the times when God has been real to us, it assures us of God's presence in this time and into tomorrow. But another thing I want to talk about today is these burning hearts that the disciples claimed that they felt when they were talking to Jesus on the road to Emmaus. These burning hearts and our tingling spines and the things that we sometimes feel in our guts and the goosebumps and the cold chills and our hair standing on end and the tears, whether of joy or of sorrow, the physicality of our inner lives, the way we feel things in our flesh. There's a physicality in this road to Emmaus story. They feel their burning hearts within them. And it wasn't a digestive thing, of course. It was what we might call the tingling of the spine. They feel it in their flesh. They feel Jesus' presence even before it's confirmed to them. He awakens something in them that they thought was dead and gone. And that awakening is a thing that they feel in their bodies. This is one of the mysterious things about resurrection, a notion that seems to hint at the holiness of our physical bodies, of these flesh selves, and suggests that they too are remembered in the redemption of all things. Now, I don't know what that could possibly mean. That is all too great for me to consider, especially when you think about the fact that our bodies are made up of other bodies from millennia ago. Who untangles all of that and how? And does it even matter? But the point is that there are times when our very flesh participates in the experience of God. It's an indication that our bodies are sacred vessels, that they too are destined for redemption in some way or another, that all flesh belongs to God and senses God's appearing and God's presence, which means that all flesh is holy and ought to be treated with respect, honored, maintained, protected, fed, sheltered, kept healthy and strong. Here we are again. We usually don't know what we've got until it begins to fade, including healthy bodies, I'd say. What would it mean for you to joyfully inhabit the body that you have today? Not the one you used to have when you were younger, not the one you wish you had, but the one you live in every day. What kind of healthy work would you give it to make it stronger? Would you think a little bit more closely about what you put inside of it before you do? Would you stop to notice God's Spirit animating it with new life, with movement, with sensation, with joy? Well, I got to admit, this sermon has been all over the map. The point of it, though, is this. God walks with us, usually unnoticed. God walks with us all the same. Up until these last, 150, 250 years, humanity has always sensed the sacredness in their lives. Humanity has always sensed that their lives were somehow of sacred importance. People looked for meaning to the stars and to the ancestors and to the gods. And here in the West, we looked to the God that we've known in Jesus Christ. We believed deeply that God was present in the world and in the things that happened to us. Even if we were just a serf on some medieval lord's fiefdom, we knew that we had our place in the big scheme of things and that we could talk to God and that God might talk to us, that somehow we mattered in the chain of being. We spoke to God. God spoke to us. The spirits spoke to us, as did the saints and the angels. They spoke in dreams and in visions and in nature and in our miraculous understanding of sacraments. There were miracles all around us, at least we thought there were. Today we don't have that, do we? We don't have that sense that God is somehow immediately present in our lives. Now, I, for one, do not want to go back to those days. And you probably don't really either. In fact, there is no going back, not now. But in losing this sense of the deep sacredness of our living, in losing this spiritual framework for our private lives, some of which was pretty hokey, and some of which was really manipulative, and some of which was damaging, in losing it, we also lost a sense of our own deep worth and the worth of other people. And yet, even our bodies are sometimes vaguely aware that God is present in our world and in our lives in a special way. And our burning hearts remind us from time to time that there is something more than we usually see, that there's another dimension to our living. All of us, if we are seated in church today, I would dare say, or if we're watching at home, all of us have probably had experiences when that veil was rolled back, was drawn back, that veil that usually hides Christ from us. And we've seen God in our lives, as it was drawn back for me in an African pulpit many years ago. Times when we've seen our sacred identities, our sacred selves, and maybe even the calling on our lives. And so what? Here's what I think you need to do. I want you to go home, and I want you to think of a time when you really felt and knew God's presence in your life. Think of a time when you realized that the stranger walking beside you was none other than Jesus. A time when the clouds parted, if only for a moment, to show you that God is active and present in your life and in the things that happen to you. Doing something, calling you somewhere. Then I want you to find an object that reminds you of that experience. For me, it's the print on the wall in my office. But for you, it can be anything. It can be a hairpin, it can be a stone, it can be a twig. It doesn't matter what it is. And put that item someplace where you will see it daily, because you need to be reminded daily that God is real and present in your life. It will be a memento vitae. You've heard of a memento mori's? The gloomy skull that philosophers and theologians used to keep on their desk to remind them that they're going to die. That was called a memento mori. This object will be for you a memento vitae, a reminder of life, a reminder that you're called to live. And then I would invite you to do as our superstitious ancestors used to do. Stop yourself frequently and ask, what is God saying to me here? Where is God active here? Where is God present in this moment? Pause to see the Jesus walking by your side. Amen.